This is going to be my third out of six sources, and it's by Peter Hick, University of Manchester in UK, supporting the development of a more inclusive practices using the Index for Inclusion. Inclusion is essential. Oh, page one. This is page 1 out of 7. Inclusion is a central issue for educational psychologists today, yet there have often been portrayed as gatekeepers to special provision. One approach to EPs to promote more inclusive practices in school is throughout the Index of Inclusion as a vehicle for consolation. This paper reports a study EPs acting as critical friends to schools during the pilot project to develop an index for inclusion in 1999. The role for critical friend the role of critical friend was investigated through interviewing EPs and others. Key themes were identified, reflecting significance of EPs' experiences and what may be helpful to colleagues interested in developing this approach. Introduction. There has been a number of services summarizing what is currently known as what works in inclusive education. For example, Bunch and Valio 1997, McGregor and Volsberg 1998, Putman 1998, Sebens Skachdev 1997, Stanback 1996, Thomas Walker and Webb 1998. However, there has been much less research showing how educational psychologists can contribute to promoting more inclusive practices by systematically or at a whole school level. Page 98 offers an overview of the role of school psychologists in inclusive education on the behalf of National Association of School Psychologists in the U.S. Page identifies her 4 strands of school psychology relevant to promoting inclusive education that builds on skills that many EPs possesses. Page lists, which is not intended to be exhaustive, as it follows. Page 2. Facilitating friendships and building social networks for students, person-centered planning for students with disabilities, instructional modifications and curricular adaptations, facilitating system changes at a building or district level. Some of these areas are arguably well established within certain educational psychology practice in the UK, for example, making recommendations for individual education plans, or setting up peer support structures such as Circle of Friends or familiar to many EPs. However, EP involvement with promoting more inclusive practices at a whole school level is perhaps the more recent development. Consolation for inclusion. Um, Consultative methods are arguably central to the role of educational psychologists in promoting more inclusive practices. Wagner 2000, O'Brien and O'Brien 1996, page 29, refer to the art of facilitating inclusion. They cite Tashi, Shapiro, Bernard, Dillon, Shu, Jorgensen, and Nisbet. Redefinition of the special education teacher as an inclusion facilitator. As an example of a school system response to inclusion, this suggests a similar challenge for educational psychologists to develop a role of inclusion facilitator through models of consolation. A number of approaches have been reported in the literature both in the US and the UK, which provide useful starting points. See, for example, House and McInerny, 1996, Heimer and McKell and Todd, 2002, Sheridan, 1996, Dobbins and Doran and Tomer, 1996, Wagner, 1998. The focus for this discussion is on the involvement of educational psychologists with one particular tool that has been developed to support school-level change, the Index for Inclusion, Booth and Anscow, 2000. This represents an approach to school self-reviewing in relation to a number of dimensions of inclusion. A possible role for educational psychologists here are in the critical friend to schools that are using these materials to support them in developing more inclusive practices. It is not proposed that only psychologists can promote this role, and that it represents the sole and necessary the best way for EPs to promote more inclusive practices in schools. The intention here is simply to investigate how EPs can contribute in this particular way and how this might relate to other aspects of their role. EPs as critical friends to school using the Index for Inclusion. This study is based on the experience of a group of educational psychologists who supported schools who using the Index of Inclusion by acting as critical friends. The Index for Inclusion was developed by the Center of Studies in Inclusive Education with colleagues from the University of Manchester and Canterbury Christ University College as a tool for schools aiming to make progress towards more inclusive practices, Booth and Anscow, 2000. These materials have been circulated by the DFES to all schools, Vaughan, 2002, and in 1998 to 1999, the index was trialed by schools in the 4 LEAs, one of which Northtown provided the context for this study. In Northtown, the educational psychology server has seen of taking a lead within the LEA and initiates and initiatives around inclusive education, and what was asked to nominate colleagues to work with the school that has agreed to participate in the index pilot project. The process of a school engaging in the index materials involves establishing a coordinating committee and involving someone from the outside school to join as a critical friend. The critical friend is an external member of the school coordinating group who is invited to act as a facilitator. The notion of a quote-unquote critical friend has well established a place in educational action research. The pilot version for the index inclusion materials gave the possible. This is page 3. The critical friend is external member. The notion of a critical friend is well established a place in educational research. The pilot version of the index inclusion materials gave the following description of this role: attending planning meetings, assisting the collection, evaluating data, and being prepared to question take for granted assumptions that may be leading to insiders to overlook possibilities for development in the school. They need someone who can establish credibility within the school, is seen as a neutral agenda, and key stakeholders within the school who is able to draw on collaborative working skills. In Northtown LEA, a number of educational psychologists were seen by schools to being able to fulfill the requirements of the critical friend role. Preparatory work included a 6-month period involvement within the Northtown Index Project, including observing meetings and school coordinators and enough critical friends. Interviews were conducted with 5 members of the school coordinating group and as sensitive to research the issues experienced by schools involved in a project. They were the head teacher, the SENCO, CENCO, a teacher, a governor, a teaching assistant, 5 educational psychologists, and 1 behavior support teacher, where they were interviewed about their role as critical friends to pilot projects using the index for inclusion. Ground theory approach was used to derive key themes of the EP interviews to identify significant aspects of EP experiences that may be helpful to colleagues who are interested in supporting schools in this way. A summary of findings in the EP interviews are given below under the headings of the following key themes: drawing on core values, engagement challenges, child-centered focus, and pre-meeting practice. Drawing on core values. Theme 1. EPs were each drawing of the personal and professional journeys towards their current understandings of inclusion in education, as a basis on which collaborative with the school coordinating groups and thinking with or alongside them and reflecting on the issues arising in each school. The starting points varied. For example, ranging from being child-centered classroom teacher, or form a commitment to resisting oppression, to the restriction educational psychology movement. The experience of using index materials to classroom with the school as a critical friend in page 4 influence the EPs involved. Anscough, Farrell, and Tweddle describe how the discourse of inclusion can vary between LEAs, and some LEAs starting out as different by showing evidence of clear and more consistent shared approach. The index materials seem to have provided a basis for a common language of conclusion for discussions in Northtown around the index. Theme 2, engagement and challenge. There seemed to be a sense of stages in development in the critical friend role, from initially encouraging schools with the index materials by adapting their use of school index toward offering more challenges to establish thinking within the school. The engagement challenge theme is concerned with the balance between providing support through reassurance and offering a challenge between critic and being a friend. The EPs who were allocated in the school which they have perceivably unfamiliar, there was an initial period of establishing credibility within the coordinating group. But when they're often able to use this, they gave them license to ask naive questions about established practices. For those who were critical friends to school, they knew well, and there was a continuing element of self-questioning about whether they're subject to pressure towards collusion with existing assumptions and practices within schools, or whether they were sufficiently independent in their approach. Theme 3. Child-centered focus. The theme of child-centered focus refers to the contribution the EPs tended to make the process of collecting and interpreting data. Often EPs found that they have been able to suggest ways of collecting data that are more directly involved pupils, or they help school to recognize pupils' perspectives more clearly than interpreting data. Several EPs describe how they encourage school coordinating groups to take data and pupils' views as well as a valid perspective in its own right from which significant lessons can be learned, even if it conflicted with adult understandings. The EP's generic role involves developing a clear focus on understanding children's views of themselves and their school experiences in a way that children rarely have opportunities to do. EPs often observe classes, interview children individually, and develop skills in eliciting children's perspectives. Whereas teachers generally work with children in groups, they might not be able to observe class or to spend extended time with individuals. Theme 4. Pre-mating practice. Pre-mating practice is concerned with the relationship between the experience of practicing the index project and the moral general role of EPs. The notion of premiation refers to whether promoting inclusion is seen by EPs as something additional to their usual role, or whether the commitment to inclusive practice shown by EPs acting as critical friends influences the whole of their work. The former approach might be described as bolt-on approach to promoting inclusion, and the latter as reflecting a permeation approach. What emerged from the interviews was that whilst the critical role within the index project was recognized as a discrete part of the EP works, it was influenced by consolation skills that they have developed through the generic role, and their approach to generic assessment work was in turn influenced by the experience in the index project. This experience seemed to have sensitized them further ways of presenting inclusion as an issue for all learners. On the other links with schools' general priorities rather than an issue concerned solely with the special education needs. Inclusion. The EP's interview with the small study showed that they were able to support the development of inclusive practices in several ways. This is page 5. They support schools in engaging with and taking ownership of the index material process. They balance the critique friend and elements within their role of sensitivity. They enable schools to focus more clearly on the perspective of the children through their collaborative inquiries. They brought their own perspectives on inclusion to the schools, often broadened within the response of working with schools and with the index process and materials. They showed the skills needed for effective collaboration consultation. The EP service took initiative in raising awareness on inclusion within the Northtown LEA at a senior level. The experience of the index project has influenced the way some EPs approach assessment. The themes identified above are a number of potential implications for colleagues planning to work with schools using the index for inclusion, by offering support of the role of critical friends. It may be helpful for EPs acting as critical friends to reflect on their own core values in relation to inclusion, and identifying their own personal and professional journeys towards understanding inclusive practices more clearly. They may find themselves better placed to support colleagues in schools and working through such issues in those particular settings. In preparing for a critical friend role, EPs may wish to consider the issues of engagement and challenge presented by school and by the index process. In the context of development of their own relationship within the schools, it may be useful for EPs acting as critical friends to be aware of the significance of pupils' perspective and evaluate inclusive practices, and to consider whether schools have been able to identify the issues clearly. Critical friends can gain from approaching their role in a spirit of collaborative inquiry, so that they are alert to possibility of learning schools about development of inclusive practices. Educational psychologists may gain from most of the experiment of the critical friend role, then they are stimulated to reflect on how far their commitment of inclusion premates their own professional practice. So that basically just gave like the gist of like a way that inclusion could be implemented, and like how basically teachers are like kind of getting to that point of like becoming more understanding, like letting go of that biasness and stuff.